Good morning, everyone. It's great to see a lot of new faces today. Thank you all for coming here. Today's scripture reading is going to be from Acts 24, verses 10 through 16. Again, today's scripture reading will be Acts 24, verses 10 through 16. When the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, "I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense. You can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple, or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues, or anywhere else in the city, and they cannot prove to you the charges they are now making against me. However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. I believe everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets. And I have the same hope in God as these men themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. I have read unto your hearing Acts 24, verses 10 through 16. May God continue to bless the hearers, readers, and doer of his word. Amen."
So you have to admit it. Did anyone find themselves getting tired of Halloween candy this week? Never, no. Yes, I did. The problem with Halloween candy is not that it doesn't taste good, it's that it affects us, right? It shapes us, and not just like body shape, but I mean it actually it shapes us in negative ways, and we have this experience that happens when we overconsume. So it's great in the short term, but there's this problem. You know, it's kind of the living example, our annual reminder of you are what you eat. Has anyone found themselves this week tired of political advertising? Yeah, that's an easier one, right? And the problem is, it's not that it doesn't taste good. Now think about this. I get these, I have this stack of stuff I have to throw away every day that comes in the mail, but if it's it's feeding something in me. If I've got a particular candidate that I already don't like or I'm going to vote against, then having a bunch of negative stuff about them kind of feeds something in me, right? It kind of you go tell them. But when I'm feeding on that stuff, the problem is, like the Halloween candies, it's shaping us. And we tend to experience this effect after over-consuming it. And, we live in a culture and especially our political culture, of negativity and urgency and panic, and every election is the last election that's going to save democracy, and, everything is at stake and all that you do. And they're wanting to shape us by kind of forcing this overconsumption on us. And I think we have to acknowledge that it has an effect on us, much like eating too much candy. That overconsumption can shape us in unhealthy ways. What we consume can wind up consuming us. I want you to look at Acts 24 this week from the perspective of a consumer and from consumers. For those that are visiting, what we're doing is we're working through the book of Acts. The Apostle Paul is on trial. The Apostle Paul has been arrested. He was in the temple. He had gone to Jerusalem. He actually was bringing a collection that he'd gathered from all these Gentile churches to help out the Jerusalem church, which was in a season of suffering, and he's brought that to them. And he was there, and then he's become a controversial figure because though he himself is Jewish, he's actually reaching out and trying to share the good news of Jesus Christ, not just with Jews, but also with Gentiles, and that's creating all this controversy for people who are, some of the Jewish folks who are very nationalistic and very anti-Gentile. And so it's led to him being arrested as he was accused of letting a Gentile into the area of the temple that they were not supposed to be in. It would be a death sentence for the Gentile if he was actually in that place. The Romans rescued him. They grab him and are trying to keep him away from this Jewish leadership that, much like Jesus, is bent on trying to execute Paul. They want to kill him the same way that they killed Jesus. And the Romans have got a hold of him. They have ushered him out despite a secret plot to kill him. They've rescued him, and they've actually brought him here for a trial before Felix in Caesarea. So they've got him out of Jerusalem. A lot of what we've been looking at the last few weeks have been this kind of pre-trial hearings that he's going through as he's trying to explain what he's about and try to make peace, but also just to continue to tell them about what he's doing and trying to tell about the good news of who Jesus is. But here we are in this trial. But what I want you to do as we kind of work through this chapter, I want you to see the whole of chapter 24 and what it's doing for us, to see how it reflects what Paul himself has been consuming. That you're seeing the outpouring of Paul's heart in the midst of this trial as he's facing death and the risk of death, as he's facing suffering, but also among those who are accusing him and then those who are listening to him and hearing him, and how their reactions to Paul show what's going on in their hearts, what's going on throughout them. So begin in Acts chapter 24. If you don't have a Bible, if you don't have your Bible with you, if you don't have a Bible to open up, I'd encourage you to get one, download it on your app, but open it up to Acts 24. And I want to work through that whole chapter. I want us to see what's going on. So they've got him there. Felix has gathered his accusers from Jerusalem. They are there, and then they're putting him on trial. And the thing I want you to see is we see kind of this is the prosecution is going to lay out its case. As the prosecution puts on its case, what we find in verse 1, you see the reference to a guy named Tertullus, and you see there that there is a problem that Paul is having to navigate a broken system that is stacked against him. Tertullus is a hired advocate. He's a good one. He's a Johnny Cochran. I mean, they got a good one. They hired themselves a good lawyer, and there is all of this emphasis throughout the text here that shows this kind of rhetorical flourish. You're really seeing the trial play out among two master speakers. They're rhetoricians, and this was an age where they put a lot of value on quality rhetoric. They would train and become experts in rhetoric, how to make a great speech. And Tertullus is that hired gun that's going to make a case against Paul. So they bring him in there, and so then Tertullus opens his mouth. Verse 2, he says this. Since he speaks to Felix, he says, "Since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation, in every way and everywhere, we accept this with all gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly, for we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world, and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him about everything of which we accuse him." Now, all of this is summary. I mean, this is something that probably would have gone on for a long, long time. And Luke is distilling this to its essence. He wants us to hear in just a few verses what it was that was going on. And you hear in those opening verses just the amount of flattery that's happening. They're just buttering up Felix here. They're talking about this great relationship of peace. But all of that is feeding something. They're feeding something in Felix, because Felix is a Roman governor, and Roman governors have a real simple job: keep the peace. As long as there is no news coming out of their area that they're the governor, then Caesar's happy, because he wants to know that everything is peaceful and everything is calm. So when he's talking about Felix's reputation of a peacekeeper, there's actually some truth in that. Like, he's actually done pretty well at that point. It's going to go pretty badly in the next few years after that. But right at this point, he actually had some success, and he had helped keep the peace. So there's a sense of Caesar wants peace for the Romans, and actually the Jews want peace too, because then that's healthier for them. So there's kind of like a symbiotic relationship here between the Romans and the Jews who live under their authority. But there's this mutual need for peace. That is Felix's charge. They would talk about the Romans would talk about the need for peace and providence of the two virtues of Roman rule. They need to rule over their people and rule over them with peace. Both are here. But then you notice that he says he wants him to really, he's asking for a kind of flexibility in applying the law. He's been a peacemaker. He's followed the law. But then you notice here, he lists all these things that he's done. You can examine him and you can find out everything of which we accuse him. He's not really following good process here, because the truth is he doesn't have a very good case. He's a great speaker. Probably is a very expensive lawyer for them to hire, and he's doing the best he can. But his main evidence, his main witness that he's going to produce is the defendant himself. That's a dangerous thing. He thinks that Paul is going to convict himself. He's offering no evidence. He really wants a kind of flexibility, and some of that's going to get exposed here when Paul mounts his response. But Paul is charged here. He's laying out the charges. This is what happens in the early stages of a Roman trial. He's laying out charges in terms a politician would understand. What is the problem? What is Paul guilty of? Why should they be convicting him here? Verse 5, he says he found this man to be a plague. He is a cancer in the land. He is a disease that is spreading. They are reframing the charges that we saw a couple weeks ago. We looked at chapter 22, 23. There he's charged with teaching against the people, which is the Jewish people, teaching against the law, the Jewish law, the Pentateuch, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and teaching against the temple. Those are the charges. None of those will stick in a Roman court. The Romans don't care about Jewish law. They don't care about the Jewish temple. They don't care about really that much about the Jewish people. They need charges that can stick in a Roman court. So here, he's a plague. He's a cancer in the land. He's a disease because he's stirring up riots. Now that's language that a Roman governor can understand, because that means if he's stirring up riots, then he's not keeping the peace. And if Paul's not keeping the peace, then Felix is not keeping the peace. And if Felix is not keeping the peace, then he's got to answer to Caesar. See, he's framing this in a way that the Roman governor can understand. He's stirring up riots among all the Jews throughout the world. And right there, you got his problem. This is his weak point that he's got in his case. Because if you want to talk about Paul's travels, and we've walked through them here over the last few months. You go look at earlier in Acts and you see Paul's 3 missionary journeys. There's a little bit of truth to what he's saying, because Paul shows up and he preaches. He always goes to the synagogues first, and he preaches about Jesus in the synagogues. And then when they don't accept what he's about, then he goes and preaches in Gentile audience. And sometimes it's stirred up the crowds, and he's had some riots. But his problem is, this is what Tertullus has to struggle against, is that's not Felix's jurisdiction. Felix doesn't have jurisdiction over what happened in Asia. He doesn't have jurisdiction over all that other stuff. He's got jurisdiction over what happened here in Israel, what happens in Judea. And Felix is interested really with what happened in Jerusalem. So all of that other stuff doesn't matter. This is where Tertullus is kind of spinning the wheels a little bit. He's got a bad case. And you can't really win the case on the facts. And so if you can't win it on the facts, you got to win it because you're going to have the flourish. You're going to have to wave your hand and kind of keep people distracted. And that's what he's doing to Felix. He's playing with them. So he's stirring up riots throughout the world. And he is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Now that's some stuff. He's stirring them up there. What does it mean that he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarene? So if he calls them a sect, what he's saying is that he's suggesting that Paul is part of some kind of spin-off that isn't real Judaism. They kind of see themselves as some kind of variant. They've kind of gone off on their own way. That's a key thing for Felix to hear, because the Romans, maybe the opposite of America today, the Romans tended to value old religions and old ideas. The Romans, they kind of were really Greek wannabes, weren't they? A lot of what they were doing was copying the Greek gods, and we'll rename them as ours. And, they're doing a lot of Greek culture and recapturing it. And but they emphasized the value of old religion. So Judaism has this interesting relationship with the Romans. Like they actually would have a certain amount of tolerance for Judaism for the most part throughout the Roman Empire. Like they wanted everyone to give credence to Caesar, but even at the point by here in the mid-first century, there's the growing emphasis on Caesar as a god, as a deity, and that's been There's an emerging cult of the emperor that's happening throughout the first century. So there's a sense where any other religion should be competing with Roman allegiance at some level. But that wasn't the Roman practice. The Roman practice would basically say, give allegiance to Caesar, and then you can keep your old practices. You can keep those old religions in place. And they tended to respect Judaism because it was old. It had been around a while. They didn't like novelty. But here, when Tertullus is describing Paul as some ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, well, ringleader sounds like a terrorist, right? I mean, it sounds like he's some kind of mob figure. He's part of some sect, so it's some new novel spinoff. Novel religions aren't trusted in the Roman Empire. And oh yeah, he's a member of the sect of the Nazarenes, which is acknowledging that he's somehow affiliated with Jesus of Nazareth, but doing it in a way that says nothing about Jesus' claim to divinity. He's really being dismissive about who Jesus is as he uses that language. And so then he ends verse 6 saying, well, he even tried to profane the temple. And that's the charge that brought him here. That's why he's in front of Felix, that's really his problem. That's the charge, and it's really a lame charge. Because how did he profane the temple? If you take their facts and just line it up, how did he profane the temple? He profaned the temple by having a Gentile friend walk in with him. Well, if that were true, and I mean it's been clear already that it's not, but even if it were true, who's the one that defamed the temple? Well, it was the Gentile. Where's he at? He didn't get arrested. There's no riot. There's nothing going on. In fact, he wasn't even with Paul at the time. So the Gentile would have been the defiler, not Paul. And that's his problem. This is the charge that fits the jurisdiction of Felix. It doesn't really fit. It doesn't work. It doesn't really have any evidence. But this is the case that he's got. This is what he has to bring. So he brings this charge. He tried to profane the temple, but we seized him, which is just an outright lie. The mob was ready to destroy him. And it's what he's suggesting there when he talks about we seized him. It suggests the temple police grabbed him. Well, no, he was rescued by Roman troops to keep a riot from erupting inside the temple, breaking the peace. So there's this clever use of language, trying to create a sympathetic ear, and at times just outright lying. And then Paul ultimately is presented as the main witness against himself, which is really the fundamental problem in this case. They've got no evidence. And so Paul is going to be the one that's going to have to testify. And then he does. So then you turn to the defense, and this is some of the piece. The first half of the defense is what Kwame read for us, but Paul points out, in the very first piece of the defense is that the prosecution has a fact problem. You know, there's this old line in all these debates we have, you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Like, you got to find out what the facts are in any kind of legal case. The first thing they're going to do is have the findings of fact, and even when they appeal cases, they'll list, here are the facts that I've based my conclusion on, and appeals courts are generally going to say, I'm going to defer to your findings of fact, and then I'm going to analyze the law based on the facts that you had. The facts in any kind of, I mean, it's just trials, but in the world we live in, you're debating over any kind of issue. Facts can be hard to discern because of spin. Like to spin your facts, kind of select which facts you want to have them here, and which do you want to kind of hold back, and how do you want to color the facts to make it look as favorable as you can. Facts aren't easy to come, right? But ultimately, you got to come at with the facts. And that's his problem. So what does Paul say? He first off in verse 10, he cheerfully makes his defense. He exudes confidence in his case and confidence really in Felix. Now, he has his own kind of flattery, but it's nothing compared to Tertullus. He says, knowing that for many years you've been a judge over this nation. He's been a governor at this point for about 5 years. He has confidence, and it's relevant to what he's doing. And then he exposes the basic problem they have. He says, verse 11, you can verify it's only been 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. I've only been around less than 2 weeks. I don't have time to be creating riots throughout the country and being a plague on the nation. I just can't. There's no time to do what they have charged him with. So they've got a fact problem here because of the timetable of what he was doing. And what did he do? He went up to worship in Jerusalem. And that begins, I think, a theme then that runs through his trial, which he wants to just say, this is what I was doing. He offers himself as a picture of integrity. He doesn't have to hide the facts. He doesn't have to color them. He doesn't have to spend them. He can present, this is who I am. This is what I've been doing. You can pour yourself into my life, and you're not going to find anything to convict me. You can verify it's no more than 12 days. And I went up to worship in Jerusalem, and they didn't find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. They can't prove to you what they now bring against me. They have a problem. In fact, that's true. He wasn't arguing with anybody. He wasn't preaching in the temple. He was there participating in a purification ritual. He was cleansing himself to go through a period of ceremonial cleansing. He was loving the law and abiding by the law and doing all these things that are holy and righteous. When they found him there, they came upon him. He then proceeds to confess to what matters most. Remember that they said he's going to be testifying against himself. So, all right, for verse 14, then this I'll confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. 14 and 15, I think, are the centerpiece of the whole chapter. This is the piece. He confesses to what matters most. What is it he's confessing to? He then uses this moment of confession. He's going to tell them this is the moment. They're all perked up. He's going to use this as a moment to witness, to testify, to advance his ministry and his mission. What was he doing? I worship. He is a good Jew who lives in the hope of resurrection. All the language here is all reinforcing that he is faithful to Judaism. I worship the God of our fathers. That's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the God that these folks also claim to worship. And he believes everything laid down in the law and the prophets. He believes the Old Testament. He believes God's revelation to his people. He believes that God said what he said. So he is faithful to it. He has a hope in God that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. And that's been the point of contention. Remember a couple weeks ago, we looked at as he's appearing before the Jewish council, before the Sanhedrin. That's the point that divided the council. Because as soon as he says he believes in hope and resurrection, that's an issue that the two groups there in the council, you have the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees believe in the resurrection. The Sadducees do not. and that's the point that's divided them. But he is saying, no, the Old Testament speaks of a hope of resurrection. And it's an interesting phrase there because it's a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. Now, what does that mean? What is the hope of resurrection for the just? Well, I think that's something that we could relate to, the idea that there is a hope of resurrection for the righteous, for those who follow God, that there will be this promise of a resurrection. And that was Jewish hope, that there was a resurrection that would come. But there is also a hope, there is a resurrection for the unjust. And what that is seems to be a reference to there is a reality of judgment. There's a judgment that's coming for the unjust. So there is a resurrection coming, and in that resurrection, there is a separation of what he calls the just and the unjust, the followers of God and those who are not the followers of God. What he is doing here, as he looks at his accusers while he's on trial for his life, is offering the hope of the gospel. Because one of the themes that we have seen throughout Acts is this is not just some amorphous hope of resurrection that God's going to make it all right. It's a hope of resurrection that has been made true and made real because of the actual resurrection of Jesus Christ. in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, he has confirmed the truth of that resurrection and given them that there is a hope. Who are the just and the unjust? That dividing line is not just the just being those who could perform enough or do enough right things or do enough right actions to justify themselves before God. No, the just are those who are justified by faith, who are justified by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. He is our hope. Here, the people he's speaking to are themselves spiritually imprisoned to a need for hope that can only be completed in Jesus. And the tragedy that runs through this trial is his accusers are accusing him, though they themselves would testify, we believe in a hope of resurrection. But it's a hope of resurrection that has been made clear and been made manifest already in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which they have rejected. They are imprisoned by this need for a hope that's already been completed in Jesus. On all of this, what I want you to see is that Paul is consistent in wanting his people to see, and Luke is wanting us to see, that the Christian faith is the completion of Jewish hope, not a rejection of it. He's not rejecting the law and the prophets. He's not rejecting what has come before, but he sees that what God has been doing, what God revealed in all of his work through Israel, through the centuries, what he has given us in the Old Testament, is a testimony of hope that has been completed in Jesus Christ. Third, I want you to see that having made this confession drives his action. Picking up right after where Kwame left off, verse 17, he says, 16 rather, he says, "So I always take pains to have a clear conscience towards both God and man." There's a hope of resurrection. It's a resurrection of the just and the unjust. I'm living in hope of that. I follow God. I'm following his what he has for us. And therefore, I want to live differently. This is the second time he's used this phrase, I have a clear conscience. His integrity is something that he puts on display. Because of his confession of Jesus Christ, he wants to live differently. He wants to live well before God. And I think that's a thread that runs through these trials. We're going to see more of it here in the chapters ahead. Why does Paul live differently? He lives differently because he's living by faith in Jesus Christ. And that faith in Jesus Christ will animate his actions. So how did it apply here? Verse 17, he said, "After several years I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings," which is what he was doing. This is the first and clearest reference in Acts to what we know is going on, because we can read Paul's letters throughout the New Testament to see what Paul had been doing throughout that third missionary journey, was taking up a collection for the Christians in Jerusalem who were suffering in the midst of, there was a famine there a few years before, there were other things going on, but he had brought this collection. This is the one clear reference we have in Acts to what he was doing. He was taking up these alms, taking up this collection, and he was going to do this. That was his reason for visiting. He was doing what actually the Jews would have celebrated as a good and noble and righteous thing, to take up alms for the poor, to help others. So he was doing this. He was presenting offerings. Again, a picture of a loyal Jew worshiping at the temple. While I was doing this, they found me, verse 18, purified in the temple. He went through this purification ritual as a way of making peace with the Jewish Christians that were concerned about his ministry to the Gentiles. This whole riot began during this purification ritual. In all of this, there was his emphasis on he's got nothing to be accused of. There's nothing they can have on him. And then what happened? While I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple without any crowd or tumult. But some Jews from Asia, they ought to be here before you to make an accusation should they have anything against me. They didn't bring their witnesses. Or else, let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the council. Other than this one thing that I cried out while standing among them, it is respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you this day. Paul has confessed to his integrity. He has opened himself up to their examination, and his actions, the way that he's living, is driving, is being driven by his belief in the resurrection of Jesus. That's why he does what he does. Now, what's the response? So that's the defense. Verse 22, but Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off. And so what we get is a kind of justice delayed. Felix's response is to play politician. So what does he do? He says this, when Lysias, the tribune, comes down, I'll decide your case. I'm going to wait and see what Lysias says. Now, what we already know from chapter 23 is Lysias has already written him a letter telling him what he thought, that Paul was innocent, and Felix has read that. So he's just putting him off. Then he gave orders to the centurion, verse 23, that he should be kept in custody, but have some liberty, and that none of his friends should be prevented from attending to his needs. So he's put him off, but then he's giving him some freedom. He's in prison, but he's got kind of some free reign. They actually did not, the state would not provide anything for the prisoners. So you have to have friends or family that are going to provide for them. He opens it up to have people visit him, to see him. In all of that, he is acknowledging tacitly that he is not a threat, but he still will not free him. There's an injustice that just is baked into his response. So he plays politician. Now we'll see more of that later, but what does Paul do in response? He uses his imprisonment to advance his mission. Verse 24, after some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. That's the subject that he's talking to, the guy who could free him at any moment. What does he want to tell him? He wants to tell him about Jesus and tell him about faith in Jesus. And as he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, "Go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you." So he has these conversations with him. He brings his wife along, Drusilla. She's a known figure. They actually, this was her second marriage. He broke up the first marriage because he decided he was after her. She's related to the Herod family. They've got a pretty rocky story, kind of a messy thing, and he's got a lot of blood on his hands. And so it's interesting that of all the things you're going to talk about with the judge is things like righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment. What he's telling him is that Jesus is the judge of the world, and that faith in him will change how we live right now. There are real and vital ethical implications of faith and the coming judgment. We should look different as Christians, as followers of Jesus. And in doing that, he is messing with Felix. He's stepping on his toes. Because what he's saying to the most powerful person in the land that he's in, he's looking him in the eye and say, just because you have all of that power doesn't mean you escape the judgment. You're going to have to give an accounting for who you are and what you have done. And your only hope, your only answer is faith in Jesus. And your faith in Jesus will change how you live. I mean, that's all of that is implied, and all of these, the language that he's using, what he's saying to him, and he's willing to take him on. And the response for Felix is to be alarmed. Now, it's meddling here. You're telling me I'm the most powerful guy in the land. Everyone tells me how great I am, that he's used to being flattered because he's got the power of life and death. And he says, well, you're facing a judge that is more powerful than you. You will give an accounting for who you are. You will give an accounting for what you have done. So it has an effect on him. He says, Felix was alarmed and said, go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I'll summon you. So he sends him away, but he keeps coming back. But then, where we end the story for Felix is you see Felix being confronted by a call of faith that he won't submit to. Very next thing it says, at the same time, verse 26, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul. So he sent for him often and conversed with him. He's waiting for a bribe. He heard about Paul taking up this collection, so he sees all these people that are helping him. He's supported while he's in prison. He wants a bribe, even though he knows he's innocent. He's already made all these, he's having conversations with them. It's quite clear he thinks he's innocent. he wants a bribe from Paul. And then verse 27, when 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. 2 years go on, and in all of that, he wants a bribe, but he's not getting any offer of money. And so then the other thing he decides he's going to do the Jews a favor. He keeps the innocent man in prison, despite his innocence, because he wants to just keep the peace. Again, this is a theme that we have seen really since Luke. As we've studied Luke and Acts together, you see this picture of broken Roman justice. Roman justice does not look good here, in the same way that it doesn't look when Pilate is interacting with Jesus in Luke. Because what he's exposing about Roman justice is being led by a broken person, a person who himself needs the gospel, but is captive, in this case, to political power. So you reach the end of this trial, and the question I'd ask you to think about is, who's the real prisoner here? Paul is preaching to Jewish leadership. And be clear, when you read through that trial, it's clear that even while he's looking at Felix, he's talking to his prosecutors. He's talking to the Jewish leadership that's accusing him. But that leadership is captive in a way that they cannot see, because they can't see the culmination of Jewish hope that has come in Jesus, their Messiah. And when he's speaking to Roman leadership, he is calling Felix to holy living in response to faith in Jesus, who is his ruler and his judge, and finding him enslaved and captive by the games of politics and power. Who's the real prisoner? The freedom that we most need is the freedom that comes only in the hope of resurrection. Jesus, the ruler of the world, the judge of the world, has given us the hope of resurrection through his own resurrection. He has ascended to the throne. Embracing that hope shapes our here and now. It shapes how we live right here as we seek to live differently, as we strive in his strength and in his power to live with clear consciences before God. So enjoy the candy, but set it down before it consumes you. And pray about what you're going to do Tuesday, but step away before it consumes you. But in all of it, trust in the hope of resurrection given to us in Jesus Christ, who is our Savior, our hope, and our judge. And let's live in clear conscience because of the hope we have in him and in him alone. Let's pray. God, I pray your blessing on each person in the room. I pray that as we are confronted with the hope of resurrection from Jesus, that it will shape how we live, that we will live differently as we are aware that he is our judge and our